You're listening to Conversations with Chanda, a Minneapolis Foundation podcast that unpacks the community's grittiest, most vexing problems, hosted by Chanda Smith-Baker. Next up is Eric Holder, a civil rights leader, former U.S. Attorney General, and the author of Our Unfinished March.
Really pleased to have you on this conversation. Now is such a great time to talk about what's happening in our country related to democracy. I read your book, The Unfinished March, which I went into it because I'm not a policy wonk. And I'm like, oh, this is going to be hard. This is going to be really, really hard. I'm going to skip through and get nuggets from each chapter and get a little taste. And that's the exact opposite of what I did. I actually listened to it on Audible, and it actually helped me quite a bit understand sort of the connection historically to now and more completely what we're facing in this country. So I just want to thank you for that, and thank you for making it accessible for someone like me.
No, it's interesting you say that, because the first couple of chapters that I wrote at the beginning of the process really kind of sounded like a law review article. And the hope that I had, along with my co-author Sam Koppelman, was to come up with a book that would be the word that you used, accessible, because I wanted people to somehow focus on the history of the vote, as we talk about in section 1, kind of where we are now in section 2, and then focus also on the proposals that we have in the third section of the book. But to do it in such a way that you didn't have to be a policy wonk to find interest in it or find joy in the reading. And I think that we've accomplished that. But so it's really good to hear you say that you found the book to be accessible, because that was one of the primary goals.
Yeah, I think it is. And the environment that we're sitting in is so concerning. I know even leading into our last election here in Minnesota, there's just these nuances that are very difficult to explain. And you talk a lot about the distance from where the electorate is to where, like, what's happening in politics. So it feels like there's such a disconnection from what people are asking for on the ground to what's happening in our government and in policy setting right now. And I was particularly concerned, and our state was particularly concerned about our younger Black male voters. And it just feels like it's not voter education. It's just like, none of it is actually working for me. So I'm just going to not participate.
Yeah. And that's something that, we hear a lot from young people generally, young Black men, I think in particular. And what I've tried to always say is that, your vote matters. And if it didn't matter, people on the other side wouldn't be doing as much as they are trying to do to make it difficult for you to vote, or to somehow eradicate the impact, the effectiveness of your vote once you cast a ballot. But, we also have to dial in, I think, some honesty here that, our political system has not been as responsive to the people as it should always be, because of, partisan and racial gerrymandering, voter suppression, attacks on our electoral infrastructure. We have governmental structures that don't necessarily reflect the will of the people. And I think we have seen that, most particularly in where we are now with regard to reproductive issues, with regard to choice, where the American people, in every state poll that was taken, said they did not want Roe versus Wade overturned. And that's, true in every state. Now, margins would be different in, say, Texas than in New York State. But nevertheless, Supreme Court did what it did, I think, in a terrible decision. And now we see state legislatures putting in place these really draconian and not publicly or not popularly supported measures to really restrict a woman's right to choose, without exceptions and a whole range of things that are being done. And I understand how that makes people, particularly young people, think that, well, the die is cast. I can't do anything that's going to affect the kind of change that I want, or have governmental policies that are responsive to the needs that I have. And what we tried to say in the book is that, every generation of Americans has been faced with these democracy challenges. They vary from era to era, but every generation has met the challenge of its time. And I don't think that this generation will fail in its duty to meet the challenges of our time. But convincing young people, that that they've got to be involved in the process is something that is a challenge. And young people don't understand that they are now the largest voting bloc in the country, 18 to 29-year-olds, largest voting bloc in the country. And they have more power than any other voting bloc, but they leave a lot of power, on the floor because they don't engage in our civic life, and most particularly don't vote in the same proportions as my generation. Baby boomers, we have more power than we are entitled to because we vote to in much greater proportions than young people do.
In the book, you give what I think is a wonderful example of some activism at North Carolina A&T. And when I was reading it, and even when I'm listening to you talk now, I wonder if there's enough examples of how organizing and power of young people is actually moving policy, maybe not at scale, but in the areas that they're in, whether or not we could do more there to share those stories, because I thought that was a fantastic story.
You see, and I think that point is exactly right. I mean, so to the extent that people generally, young people in particular, think, well, I can't affect change. The system is rigged against me. Well, you look at that young woman, Love Caesar, at North Carolina A&T, who with a piece of chalk, drew a line down the middle of the campus. North Carolina A&T is the largest African-American, largest, historically Black college or university in the country. But it was gerrymandered by the Republicans in North Carolina. One half of the campus was in one congressional district. The other half of the campus was in another congressional district. If you changed dorms over the course of the year, you went from one congressional district to another, you weren't registered to vote, in one or the other. She saw this, recognized that diluted the power of that substantial African-American community, drew a line right where the line was drawn that split the campus. Kids got up the next day and said, what's this chalk line? What's going on here? And she explained to them, our power is being diluted as a result of this partisan gerrymander. She got in touch with us at the National Democratic Redistricting Committee. We filed a lawsuit. That lawsuit was ultimately held up by the Supreme Court of North Carolina, and the lines were redrawn. And the campus was all put into one district, and they ended up electing a person who was more consistent with the values that the students had at North Carolina A&T. And so that's the power of one young woman, Love Caesar, with a piece of chalk, who made a difference in the North Carolina political system, elected a congressman who otherwise would not have been a member of the United States House of Representatives. And so telling those kinds of stories, I think is really important, not only to give her the credit that she's due, but to make people understand that the power of the individual is still of consequence.
I know growing up, I didn't have as much opportunity as I wish growing up in our educational system to learn about our history. As a Black person, I did not hear sort of the diversity of history, the extent in which I should have understood what SNCC was doing, the organizing, the leadership that was coming from our community at really important moments in really important ways. I just had a conversation with a guy named Jesse Leone, and he said the first time I saw Eyes on the Prize was when I was in a community college. He's like, why isn't every kid in this country learning about this stuff earlier? And so in the book, you talk about being, I think it was around 12 years old, and watching sort of the civil rights movement unfold. And I imagine that was pretty informing to your upbringing and where you landed. I used to always feel very jealous about your generation and felt like I missed something, but it feels like we're in a moment now. So I'm wondering if you could just share sort of maybe a little bit of history of what you witnessed around voting and participating that would help us ground our listeners on who you are, what you're motivated by, but also what our opportunity might be.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. We look back at history, again, generally, and the civil rights movement, I think more specifically, in kind of a gauzy way. People think about the civil rights movement and a great speech that Dr. King gave at the March on Washington in 1963. And we tend to not remember that an animating part of the civil rights movement, really the glue of the civil rights movement, was the fight for the right to vote. And 63 civil rights movement also talked about, economic empowerment, jobs, and things like that. But when you think about the Selma to Montgomery March, that was all about the right to vote. The Freedom Summer in 1964, when those three civil rights workers, Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman, lost their lives, they were trying to register people to vote in Mississippi. The crown jewel of the civil rights movement is the Voting Rights Act of 1965, all about, again, the right to vote, to enfranchise, a segment of our population that, though free for 100 years back in the 60s, never really enjoyed the full benefits of their citizenry. And I had the opportunity, just given by when I was born, to see all of this stuff on a small black and white television. Didn't have color TV back in those days. In New York City, in my basement, to see, the March on Washington, to see my sister-in-law denied the opportunity to integrate the University of Alabama, an attempt to stop her from integrating the University of Alabama in 1963, to see the Edmund Pettus Bridge incident in 1965, to see African countries becoming independent, Caribbean countries where all of my relatives are from, become independent. And so I was just, a young guy, 12, 13, beginning my teenage years, in the midst of all of this. And so I lived it. And we have to make sure that people understand, in ways that they do not, the fact that the civil rights movement ended a system of American apartheid. An American apartheid system was destroyed by the civil rights movement. And we need to have the understanding that, Black history is in fact American history, and that what happened in the civil rights movement changed this nation even beyond the impact that it had on African Americans. It engendered in other groups of people, women, the desire for recognition and rights, the LGBTQ community, the desire for recognition and the acquisition of rights. All of that stuff was unleashed by the civil rights movement. And so we need to study it. We need to understand it. We need to make it a part of our regular curriculum, not have, we need to have, as I said in the speech, a Black History Month, because we don't do enough teaching of Black history and the civil rights movement in our regular history courses. But we need to get to a place where a Black History Month perhaps is not needed, because we are studying and understanding Black history through the teaching in our regular curriculums.
You mentioned the GLBTQ community, and I just want to acknowledge yet another tragedy that has happened over the weekend. Our co-producer of this podcast, Supak, needed to take time today because she belongs to that community, and she's just devastated by the level of hate and the violence that was perpetrated once again, an act of domestic terrorism. Do you think that there will be a time where we won't see that happening? Is it because we're so polarized, or?
No, it's not a function of this time. Hate is a virus, and it's in the American body politic. And unless we are aware of its existence and take measures to suppress that virus, inoculate ourselves periodically against that virus, it will rear up. And as we have just seen again with that most recent and heinous attack, we will see it again. Now, some periods in our history are more infused with hate than others. And I think it's because, we let our eye off that virus, and, we allowed it to fester. And I think, unfortunately, at least one segment of our political population thinks that by dividing us, by speaking about groups of people in hateful ways, that it will serve their political interests without taking into account what that means and the risk it puts at people in a variety of groups in. And so, yeah, I think we'll get through this. It's happened way too often. We have to also take into account the proliferation of guns in this country. I was looking at just a list of all of the mass shooting incidents that have happened in the last, I guess, 4 or 5 years or so. And every one of them has an AR-15, a long rifle, that is a part of the equation. And so that combination of hate and weaponry in the hands of really kind of addled people leads to the kind of incident that we're dealing with yet again.
Yeah, when we were talking about sort of the distance of where community sits and where our policies are heading, I did reflect a little bit on the NRA and even its membership would like some common sense gun laws enacted. And so again, we see the separation from what sort of the structure is from what the membership or the community is interested in. And that's another one that, and I often say, gun violence is not something that we should all become proximate to before we start acting and making a difference. It is something that we can do today to push change.
Yeah. I mean, what just recently happened was not something that only impacted people in Colorado Springs, gay people in Colorado Springs, or gay people in Colorado. I mean, that impacted all of us. Yeah. Those are our neighbors, our fellow citizens, residents of this country, and we should feel as impacted by what happened there as what happened in Uvalde, what happened at the Tree of Life in Pittsburgh. I mean, these are all things. These are our friends. These are our neighbors. These are our people who have been the subjects, the objects of this violence. And it shouldn't take something in your neighborhood, something happens to your, as you define your community, your group, to feel a sense of concern and a desire to be involved in the solutions to the problems that lead to these heinous acts. There's enough there now for all of us to be concerned, for all of us to ask ourselves, what are you doing to counter that hate? What are you doing to make this nation safe for everybody?
With women's rights, you talked about the Supreme Court in the book. You also talk about the courts and these lifetime appointments. And, we age differently now than they did when those laws and that was put in place. Would you mind sharing a little bit on what you might recommend and what you see as maybe an opportunity with the Supreme Court?
Sure. When our republic was founded, we decided, and it makes sense, to insulate judges, federal judges, by giving them life tenure. And so most people in the beginning parts of the republic left the Supreme Court when they died. We didn't live nearly as long as they didn't live nearly as long as we do now. But over time, we have lived longer. And so now we have people who get appointed to the court in their early 50s, late 40s, and they can stay on the court for 30 and 40 years. And I think that's entirely too long for somebody to be in an unelected position with that much power. People now leave the court. They decide when they're going to leave the court, and they try to do these strategic retirements. And this is Democrats as well as Republicans. This is not just, one side or the other. They leave when they have a president in place who they think will put in their seat somebody who will share their worldview. And so my proposal is that we have term limits, that you serve on the Supreme Court for a period of 18 years. As I note in the book, it's one of those rare instances where the Chief Justice and I are in the same place. He says that we should have term limits of 15 years. I say 18, because I also say that we should have a system where presidents put somebody on the Supreme Court in the first year of his or her term, and also the third year of his or her term. So every president would appoint a justice first year, third year of his or her term. So every president would get at least 2 if you only serve, one term, and 4 if you serve 2 terms. And if you make it 18 years, that would mean that over the short term, the court would expand. But ultimately, at 18 years, and with that first and third year appointment, the court would shrink back down to 9 members. So I think the expansion of the court would make sense in the short term. And I also think that, depressurizing the selection and confirmation process by making it something that happens in a more regular way would mean that you'd end up with a court that was not as disconnected with people serving 25 and 30 years and was almost like a monastery up there now. And we'd have a court that would still be insulated, still, not subject to the whims of our politics, but at least more connected to the desires of the American people. Because I think what the court is doing now in a whole range of areas is, I think, first off, not principled, not consistent with precedent. It's a function of personnel on the court, but they're doing things that are inconsistent with the desires of and inconsistent with the best interests of the American people.
I have a couple of questions that I got forwarded to me. One is, what role did redistricting efforts play in last week's election results? Do you have an idea of how that may have impacted it?
Yeah, the work that we did at the National Democratic Redistricting Committee, we started back in January of 2017 to try to make the redistricting process more fair in 2021, 2022. I think it's had a dramatic impact. Redistricting is fundamentally different this decade than it was in 2011. We saw state legislatures flip. You certainly witnessed in Minnesota, what happened there with one of the chambers of the state legislature there, flips in Michigan, in Pennsylvania. The New York Times looked at the districts that were created as a result of this most recent redistricting process and said that 75% of them were fair. And that's a substantial increase from the rankings from a decade ago. But it also means that 25% of the districts were considered unfair, considered to be gerrymandered. And you see those gerrymandered, partisan and racial gerrymandered districting plans, mostly in Republican-controlled states like Texas, Georgia, Florida, Wisconsin. And so the process was certainly better, way better than it was a decade ago. We saw results of that in the past midterms that we just experienced, where election deniers were defeated, all over the country, where you have a more fair system and where you have legislative houses that are more consistent with the makeup of the people, a House of Representatives that, again, is more fair than it was in 2012 when Democrats won 1.4 million more votes than Republicans in 2012 and ended up with a 33-seat deficit. They were in the minority by 33 seats, although they won 1.4 million votes. This time around, we have a House of Representatives that's basically split. I mean, it's going to be a 4 or 5 vote margin, something like that. That is more reflective, I think, of the United States. And had those districts been more fair in Texas, Georgia, Florida, you would have ended up with Democrats actually controlling the House of Representatives. So a lot of work that was done that I think was very positive, but there's still more work to do.
How can we best address the massive efforts of disinformation targeted at our electorate?
Yeah, that is a really, really good question. And the impact of that disinformation, I think, has been underappreciated. If you get into a silo, these echo chambers where you're only hearing, one kind of voices, and those voices are peddling huge amounts of disinformation, you then make electoral choices on the basis of that information, and that skews, the results of our election. And so I think people have to, tear yourself away from whatever it is, that favorite channel you always watch, and watch a wide range of things on television. People need to read more, and again, from a variety of sources. But I also think that there is going to be the need for some kind of regulation. We have this thing, the fairness doctrine, where television stations have to carry certain amounts of programming and have to make sure that they're trying to do things in a fairly balanced way. I think we have to start looking at that in terms of the internet. So many of us, and especially young people, get their information from the internet. And you can, either from foreign actors or from, domestic actors, they can do things with knowing what the algorithms are like, push you in certain directions, suppress, the dissemination of other kinds of information. And so I think that, I would hope that the folks who run these big internet information dispensers will do something voluntarily. Mm-hmm. My guess is that over time, in the absence of movement by them, that government is actually going to have to do something at regulating. So I think there are things that we can do to expose ourselves to more and to decrease the impact of disinformation. But I also think there's a role for regulation as well.
We have folks that are arguing free speech. And so this is not about freedom of speech. It's about making sure that what is being said is accurate and factual. Is that really the line as the listeners are, I don't want anyone telling me what I can say or whatever, but we're not talking about that.
No, not at all. I mean, everybody ought to be free to say whatever it is that you want to say. But we should all agree on kind of what the facts are, and then we can argue about what we want to do with the facts. Disinformation is not about disseminating views; it's about disseminating untruths. And, even there, I don't want to be, some First Amendment, destroyer, because, even I defend the ability of people to say things that, in fact, aren't true. But we have to understand, in this digital age in which we live, the dissemination of untruths can really be spread quickly, widely, and have a really negative impact on our society. And so I think we need to have rules that respect the First Amendment, but also rules that recognize the different environment in which we now operate.
So part of the misinformation, and I think you touched on it a little bit, is people meddling in our election. And so how is it possible for people to meddle, Russia to meddle in the election as much as they have? Like, what precautions do we need to prevent that from happening?
Yeah, I think that really is on the providers. Okay. To the hosts, these folks on the internet, they've got the best and the brightest working for them in Silicon Valley and in other places. And there are ways in which they can figure out, who are bots, who are not real people, and also figure out, where is this information coming from? It was interesting. I was in Wisconsin, I guess during the 2018 election, 2018, maybe, I think it was 2018. And there was a police officer involved in a shooting of a young Black man. And there was tons of stuff, that got into the Wisconsin ecosphere there through the internet. And they were able to trace a lot of that stuff to see that a lot of what was being said about, trying to split the African-American community from the police was actually coming from Russia. Now, if you could do that in that particular case, I understand this is going to be resource intense, but the stakes are so high that I think that's the kind of thing that you have to be able to do. And to the extent that you can identify, foreign sources as being the ones who are sharing that disinformation. Now, they don't have a First Amendment right. Countries outside these borders, people outside these borders, non-citizens outside these borders don't have First Amendment rights. And so cutting the cord there is something that I think that we certainly ought to be doing. And there, I think you have to have public-private partnerships. Folks who run these internet disseminators of information, working with, in particular, the federal government to identify and then to isolate these attempts at disinformation that come from offshore.
Do you think that the providers of those resources on the internet understand the stakes?
That's a really interesting question. And I'm not totally sure what the answer is. I mean, it's certainly something that I, in my interactions with them, have said, which is to say, look, there's a couple of realities you have to face. One is that there's a lot of disinformation out there. And two, either you're going to regulate it or you're going to have regulation imposed upon you. Now, I can't say it's going to happen over the next year, the next 2 years, but at some point, the system is going to say, government is going to say that you have not regulated this sufficiently, and therefore we are going to do it. And my pitch to them has always been, it is much better to have effective self-regulation than to have government-imposed regulation that might not be sensitive to or knowledgeable about, the intricacies of your business.
So in chapter 9, you ask a question, and I'm just going to repeat it to you because it really sat with me. And it was, how do we make the Senate better reflective of the will of the people in its current form? And I do think we've touched on this a little bit, but I was really fascinated sort of by that. And I think it has to go with where the lines are drawn, and some other suggestions that you made. Could you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, we look at this great experiment of ours that we call America. And it is, we're an exceptional nation. We're the most exceptional nation, I think, that's ever existed. And yet, we are almost 250 years old, and we're dealing with a constitution that was, produced back in the 18th century. And it has a ton of good stuff in it. But as the nation has grown, as it has expanded, as more people have become part of our democracy, some of the things that were put in place back then, I think, need to be examined and need to be updated. If you look, for instance, at our Senate, we say 2 people, 2 senators per state, part of the Great Compromise, and that's fine. But we now have in place where Wyoming gets 2 senators, and they have 500, 600,000 people, and California gets 2 senators, 35 million people, something like that. And so that becomes really kind of a disparity there. The Senate is, really a powerful place. And, we see now that, you could end up with people who represent just about 20% of the nation's population can control the majority of the Senate just because of the way in which, we have that 2 senators per state rule. And so to change it would mean changing the Constitution. That I don't think is likely to happen, but you can, just by legislation, admit, and this is my proposal, Washington, D.C. as a state, Puerto Rico as a state, which would mean that certainly from Washington, D.C., you're likely to get 2 more Democratic senators, which would, I think, deal with the imbalance that we see now, and potentially a couple of Democratic senators from Puerto Rico, although Puerto Rico has enacted on an island-wide basis. They've elected on an island-wide basis on Republicans as well. So that's one of the things. We also need to end the filibuster, which has allowed a minority in the Senate, about 40%, can tell the other 60%, and again, represent a small number of the American people, that something that the American people want to have happen is not going to happen because this minority in the Senate says that the Senate can't vote. A lot of people think that, to get things passed in the Senate, you have to have 60%. That's just a made up rule. That was not really used an awful lot until the last 10, 15 years or so. And the founders, when they were considering whether or not to require supermajorities or just majority rule, having had the experience with the Articles of Confederation, they said, no, majorities are what we should have. Otherwise, the minority will have too much power. And that's what we see in the filibuster in the Senate. And also with regard to the way in which we allot senators. We give an awful lot of power to the minorities that frustrate the will of the majorities. Now, minorities always have to be protected, and that is another part of our constitutional scheme. But you can't give ultimate power to minorities.
So you talked about gerrymandering, and you used the word cracking and packing, and I think we talked about this with the university story, but I'd never heard packing as a concept before. So cracking is essentially taking an area, right, and just splitting it in half to reduce the likelihood of representation, right? Like to maintain party control. Is that what that is?
Yeah. You take a group of people and you put them in a whole variety of different districts, and therefore you dilute their power. Instead of having, like at North Carolina A&T, one large Black community that would have a lot of power, you put them in two different districts, which decreases their power by 50%. That's called cracking.
That's the pack. And then the packing part is packing it all together. Is that it?
Yeah, you draw lines in such a way so that in Alabama, where African Americans make up about 27% of the population, and if you just do the math, there's 7 districts, they should have probably 2 districts that would allow for African Americans to pick who their representative is. You draw the lines in such a way so that you pack all of the African Americans into one district, and therefore, instead of having the ability to elect 2 congressmen, they only have the ability to elect 1. A court in Alabama, 3-judge court in Alabama, including 2 Trump-appointed judges, said that violated the Civil Rights Act of 1965. The Supreme Court now has that case before it, and we'll see what the court does with that decision.
And then the last piece, I think, around what you define as a crisis in representation would be around the presidential elections, where we are and have elected presidents that have not had the most votes. Is there something that we could do about that so that that position, that great role that we need in our country is actually more representative of what the electorate wants?
Yeah, we don't elect presidents by the popular vote. We elect presidents through the Electoral College, which was put in place by the founders because they did not trust the ability of regular Americans to make wise decisions. And so they wanted to have them cast votes to pick electors who would ultimately decide who the president would be. And we've had a few instances, certainly we've had 2 in recent years, where, presidents, George W. Bush and Donald Trump, did not win the popular vote, but won the Electoral College. And as a result, became president, even though they didn't get the majority of the votes. And as I say in the book, we're the only industrialized country in the world that does this. And, when we held elections, whether it's for class president, PTA president, it's always like whoever got the most votes is the person, who wins. And so I think we need to change that. Now, again, we need a constitutional amendment to get rid of the Electoral College. And with a filibuster in place, that becomes difficult. And trying to get, 3/4 of the states to go along with would also be difficult. But this is what you can do. There's this thing called the National Popular Vote Compact, which says that instead of states casting their electoral votes for who won that particular state, every state would cast its electoral votes for who won the national popular vote. And if you do that, then the person who won the popular vote would also win the greatest number of electoral votes, and you would do away with these anomalies that we have seen, twice in recent years. This is something that is being considered by the states, and once you get to 270 electoral states that total 270 electoral votes, this then goes into effect. You don't need to have all states will agree to that. Only that states that come up with 270 electoral votes, because that is actually the number that you need to become president. And I think we're at about 193 electoral votes now with regard to the states that have agreed to it. And so I think Michigan is the next state that will consider it. And then it's going to become more difficult because you're going to have to get into some Republican states to go along with it. But we got to come up with something so that the will of the people can be expressed. With regard to the one office that we have in this country that is supposed to be a national leader and not have it decided by potentially, as we have seen twice, a minority of the people. The majority of the people ought to elect who the president of the United States is.
Mm-hmm. That seems common sense to me.
Yeah, like I said, class presidents. When you were in the 3rd grade or the 4th grade and you wanted to pick the class president, if Mary got the most votes, she was the class president. You didn't go you didn't vote and then pick an electoral college to decide, Mary, for whatever reason, didn't have enough whatevers. And so John's going to be the class president, even though Mary got more votes.
Mm-hmm. So this is a question that came from Resma. What does the infrastructure look like in order to get an anti-Blackness hate crime bill passed?
Yeah, it's we again need to make sure that our structures are consistent with the desires of the people. And we expanded the hate crimes bill to include we made it more difficult the way the hate crimes bill was originally passed, to include people of color, at least the level of intent that you had to show, and to include people from the LGBTQ community. It's something that I fought for when I was Deputy Attorney General during the Clinton years. It ultimately didn't pass the expansion until I was Attorney General. And so we have a much more robust hate crimes bill that allows federal prosecutors to be involved in these crimes in ways that were not possible before the passage of or the expansion of the hate crimes legislation that happened during the Obama years.
Is there anything that the current president could do to advance either on some of the things that we touched on or on the anti-hate crime bills? Is there anything that Biden's administration can do at this point to forward those efforts?
Yeah, there's certainly executive orders. I mean, I suspect that with a Republican House, you're not going to see much legislation passed over the next 2 years. But the president still has a lot of executive power so that he can sign executive orders. There's still the Justice Department that has the ability to decide how it's going to deploy its resources, what things it's going to prioritize, where it's going to place federal agents. And so the Justice Department, I mean, that was one of the things that I made a priority, the anti-hate crimes, action by the Justice Department. President Obama signed a number of executive orders in that regard. And so President Biden will have that ability. Merrick Garland at the Justice Department will have that ability, working with other executive branch agencies as well. I think, as I said, realistically, we're not likely to see much by way of legislation in this regard because of the split that we now have in Congress, Republicans controlling the House of Representatives and Democrats controlling the Senate.
What are your thoughts on the Supreme Court's deliberation regarding affirmative action in education?
Yeah, I'm really worried about where the court is going to go in that case based on the questions that we heard during oral argument. The notion that colleges and universities cannot take into account race to try to make their campuses more diverse, which I think enhances learning. If you have a homogeneous group of students listening to a professor or studying, a certain number of books, their learning is enhanced when they're interacting with students who are different than they are. And, we have had affirmative action, for a long time. If you are the son or daughter of a person who gives money to, an Ivy League college, you're more likely to get in. That's affirmative action. If you're an athlete and, you get to go to a great state university, that's affirmative action. There's a whole range of ways in which we have had affirmative action. The Supreme Court doesn't want to allow race to be at least a factor, not a sole determinant, but a factor in the admissions determination. Now, we've said you can't do quotas, and I think that makes a great deal of sense. But I think we should, recognize that we're not yet at the point where we need to be when it comes to all things racial, and that there are still inequities that we have to deal with, and that the learning experience is enhanced by having people from different geographies, different demographic groups, different economic groups, all a part of the experience. We shouldn't admit to our best institutions simply people who score the highest on their SATs. You want a whole range of people to be a part of that academic experience. But I'm really concerned that this court is going to say that you cannot consider race when it comes to making determinations about who you admit. That I think that's just a wrong decision.
Is there anything that we can do as we prepare for the decision? Are there actions that can be taken?
Well, it's interesting. I think that you're going to see a lot of colleges and law schools, professional schools say, all right, what we're not going to do, we're not going to rely on standardized tests. We're going to not listen to the SATs or to the LSATs, the ACTs. We are going to look at, your academic record. We're going to look at where you come from. And so they will, in essence, come up with ways in which they keep their admitted student classes diverse without specifically being hindered by these statistical things that point in one and only one direction. So that's my hope. On the other hand, what we have seen where race was taken out as a possible consideration in the University of California system, we saw a precipitous drop in the number of African Americans and Hispanic students who actually enrolled in the University of California system. And I understand there's been a slight uptick recently, but the number has really gone down dramatically. And that is the concern that I have, that we will see that dramatic drop, at least in the short term. But I suspect that the academic community is going to try to come up with ways in which they continue to keep their classes diverse while following the dictates of this expected Supreme Court ruling.
Yeah, and the dramatic, I think I was reading about this. I think it was like a 30% drop.
Yeah, it's really tremendous in California. The number of people who are of color and who go to the University of Cal system is fundamentally different now than it was before that proposition was passed in California.
I just have these moments where I just can hardly believe like the reversal that is happening in this country. And I don't consider myself to be Pollyannish, but I feel like I'm being disrupted in a way that's really concerning as a person of color, as a woman, as a mother. Like, I just feel like the actions, I think at the local is probably the best place, is where we started from, is, exercising our right to vote, and having more broadly our system understanding the political power that we hold and acting into it collectively, that we can't be passive players in what's happening because it feels very designed to reverse us and to maintain power.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. We have to be engaged. The reality is this: if we are passive, that means that we leave a vacuum that will be filled by people who are, less committed to American ideals, less idealistic, more politically inclined. The vast majority of the American people agree on a substantial number of issues. You'd never believe that if you listen to, the news. But those people who are in the minority are often the loudest. And then with the spread of disinformation, they have the ability to, engage in political action and get political power that's not commensurate with their representation in the overall population, or even with regard to, how the American people feel about a particular issue. You think about this: the American people, like 80, 90%, agree that you should do background checks before anybody has the ability to buy a gun. That's just kind of common sense. And yet we don't see, these bills passed in the states by our federal government, because we have a loud minority coupled with, gerrymandered political power that thwarts the will of the majority. And then you see that in a whole range of issues, whether it's reproductive choice, protection of voting rights, as I said, gun safety measures, climate. There's a whole bunch of places where the American people get it. The American people are not stupid. They see the world around them. They understand what fairness is, and I think our political leadership has failed us.
I was just reminded, I did a gun buyback some years ago, and it was more of a way of me sort of bringing full circle. I lost a cousin to gun violence and was working in an organization, and we did this gun buyback, and we wanted to give the pieces of the guns to artists to make a statement on the violence that has been perpetrated against them and their families, to just make a broader statement. And so we partner with the fire stations. We're in there and I pull up to go in, right? We're giving small amounts of money, depending on what kind of weapon you bring in. And someone from a pickup pulls up across the street, offering more money for the guns. No, like we have the police department there. We're doing everything like I think is proper to do. And here it is that you can buy guns out of a pickup right here in the neighborhood. And it was legal. I just could hardly believe it. I think I conceptually knew it, but I think being in the experience, I'm like, how is this possible?
Right. Well, that's what I was talking about before, about this notion of background checks. We have a background check system in place now, but it doesn't cover the private sale of guns from one person to another, or doesn't deal with the sales that happen at gun shows, and so, again, the American people say, well, if you're going to sell a gun to somebody, you ought to make sure that the person getting it doesn't have some kind of protective order against him, is not involved in some kind of domestic violence thing, is not a felon, a whole range of things that the American people agree on. And again, so we have a background check system that everybody agrees needs to be expanded, and yet the minority, and it's not even with the minority, you look at the NRA. I mean, NRA members, last poll I saw, over a majority of them are of the same mind, that, we ought to make sure that, people who acquire guns don't have these disabilities that should keep them from getting a gun. Again, like I said, felons, people involved in domestic violence. I mean, there's a whole range of things that if we were more careful, banning the use or the sale of assault weapons, we could make this nation safer, and the American people agree upon that.
Yeah. So I work in philanthropy, and so one of my questions almost always is, do you think that there is a role for philanthropy in moving sort of a healthy democracy forward? And if so, what would you recommend for how people are yielding their influence and their resources towards a healthier, safer nation, really?
I think there's definitely a role for the philanthropic community to be involved in protecting, enhancing our democracy. And I understand the reticence that some have, because they say, well, that's going to get us into politics. We're a 501c3. We're not supposed to be involved in political activities. But the reality is that our democracy is fragile. Our democracy has to be protected. And so philanthropies can find ways in which you are supporting things that are really nonpartisan, but are pro-democracy. Supporting, like as the League of Women Voters does, making sure that our voting system is fair. It doesn't favor one party or the other, but just making sure that people have the ability to acquire ballots, cast ballots that will ultimately be counted. Try to ensure that, polling places are open, that there are sufficient numbers of polling places. Again, that doesn't favor one party or the other. But yeah, I do think that there is a role for the philanthropic community to play in our democracy protection efforts. And, here's the deal. People say, I'm being an alarmist. I'm being hyperbolic when I say that, our democracy is at risk. Well, history tells us, and you look at Europe in the 20th century, fascism rose there, not because fascism was strong, but because the defense of democracy was weak. And it doesn't mean that we'll have a dictator here in the United States, but you could render elections every 2 years, every 4 years, every 6 years. You could render them meaningless if our democracy is not protected. You will still go to the ballot boxes and, we'll still pull levers and vote for people, but the results can almost be predetermined and our democracy crippled unless we are willing to protect it. And it means, I think, that the philanthropic community has to figure out a way in which it can be involved in that effort.
Because I think you say in the book that essentially what's happening now is that our politicians are speaking to the extreme on both ends.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, as a result of gerrymandering in particular, you crack and pack districts so that you come up with safe seats for people in one party, which means that people in the Republican Party speak only to the folks on the right. People in the Democratic Party tend to speak to people on the left. And you're worried not about a general election in a gerrymandered seat, you're worried about a primary challenge. And if you're worried about a primary challenge, then you want to make sure that if you're a Republican, you're as far right as you can be so that you don't have a challenger. If you are seen working with your Democratic colleagues to try to come up with a solution to a particular problem, that's seen as a sign of weakness and invites a primary challenge. And so nothing gets done. And the American people see that nothing gets done in our political system, and that breeds cynicism and a lack of faith or trust or belief in government, which is just not good for us generally and not good for our democracy, most specifically.
What is giving you hope right now? Because I think hope is necessary because grief feels deep and there's a lot happening. What is bringing you hope?
It's like I say in the book, our unfinished march. What gives me hope are a couple of things. First, our history. The first part of the book deals with the historical part. And people say, I don't want to read history. No, it's really interesting history. It's really good. You're going to find out some interesting people and things that they did in their time. But our history shows us that every generation of Americans, when faced with challenges to our democracy, came up with ways in which they did defend democracy, whether the threats were internal or whether they came from external places. We fought wars to protect democracy. We enfranchised greater numbers of people in our country to protect democracy. And so our history tells us that every generation of Americans has risen to the challenge. And I think that this generation of Americans will rise to that challenge as well. The other thing that gives me great hope is young people. Young people, I still think of myself as young at heart, but I can't say that I'm a young person. But this younger generation is not burdened by the racial baggage that other generations have had. They are more accepting of diversity. They are more inclusive in their view of society. And I think that as they get more politically involved, more civically engaged, coupled with that history that gives me hope, I think those two things will ultimately get us to that better place. And I think that we have to be optimistic. Optimism leads to activism. Pessimism leads to inaction. So there's no reason to be pessimistic. There's every reason to be optimistic. There's every reason to be engaged.
All right, Eric Holder, Our Unfinished March. It was a great book, I have to say. It was really good. I hope that our listeners' curiosities were piqued on the topics that we touched on. Grab the book. It was very good for someone who's not a policy wonk like myself, but I also think others that are very much into policy, community, and democracy will enjoy it. So I am highly encouraging readers to the book. Any other resources that you would recommend that people could check out if they want to get more involved in these issues?
Well, one other book I would recommend is a book called The Second Founding by a guy named Eric Foner. Really examines now this is a little more wonky, examines the Civil War amendments and the impact that it has had immediately, and then the impact that those amendments have had on in our country. But there's also, want to get a better sense of the civil rights movement. PBS did a great series a while ago called Eyes on the Prize, which you can still get. It's, 8, 9 parts or something like that. You spend 8 or 9 hours watching that, watch an hour a day. You will be shocked by the history that you see, the optimism that it will generate in you. But the other thing I would also suggest to people is to just get civically engaged and find organizations that are involved in the work. If all of us get more civically engaged, we can move this nation to that better place. It doesn't mean you have to do political things, get involved with, getting attention to the young people in your community who are starved for the kind of attention that every American, boy or girl is entitled to. It won't be an easy thing. You have busy personal lives and busy professional lives. But if you find an hour, couple hours a week to do that, you're going to feel better about yourself and you're going to make this nation better.
And that's Eric Holder and our host, Chanda Smith Baker. If you enjoy this show and want to learn more about what we do here at the Minneapolis Foundation, please visit us online at minneapolisfoundation.org. And thanks for listening to Conversations with Chanda.